Switch right now to share screen and we can kind of launch in.
Yep.
Jen, does that work for you?
Yeah, great. Go ahead. Okay, I'm going to just say hi and welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming on this beautiful summer day. And feel free to type anything in the chat window. We're a pretty informal group, and I'm really happy that Maureen and Jenni have agreed to share their wonderful insights into integrating OER into their learning designs. I've seen them speak about this a few times, I think, and I always get something new. So thank you so much. For those of you who don't know Maureen and Jenni, I don't have the formal bio, sorry. But,
no problem.
Maureen is an instructional designer with Ryerson University, and Jenni works as a program manager with eCampusOntario. So I'm going to just hand it over to you both, and thanks again for offering your advice today.
Thanks, Joanne. Actually, since we're a fairly small group, would people be comfortable just doing a quick round the table in terms of introductions for participants, and so maybe starting with Nydia?
Sure, no problem. So I hit the video. So I'm Nydia Serna, and I'm working as an instructional designer at the McMaster University Center for Continuing Education.
Great, thanks. Ian, you've been patiently with us.
My video, I'm on a computer without video right now. I'm an instructional designer, excuse me, from George Brown, and I've been here working on about 5 years or so.
Great, thanks. Irene?
Hi, I'm Irene Stewart from St. Clair College. I'm a college faculty member assigned to student services, and I am presently designing a course for student success for students, and there's a few other ones that we'd like to do from our department area.
Great. Thanks, Irene. Hey, Sarah. Are you there? I think you're still muted, maybe, Sarah.
Oh, is that better?
Yep.
Perfect.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Wendorf. I'm an instructional designer here at, look at the camera, here at Cambrian College in Sudbury.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. I think, did I get everyone? Sorry.
I think so. Everybody knows Joanne.
Yes.
Yeah, I hope everyone knows me by now. Oh, shut up. But I do work with eCampusOntario.
Okay, so I will share a screen now and just launch in, and Jenni, definitely chime in if I go astray. Okay, one sec. Okay, here we go. Okay, so.
All right, looking good, Maureen. We can see it.
Okay. So I think we have about half an hour, and I thought in that time I will try to give you a bit of background on why Jenni and I decided to work on this package of materials that we're going to share with you today, kind of the background on that. And then Jenni and I will actually walk you through the materials and share them with you because they were absolutely designed with sharing in mind. It's nice with a small group. Hopefully we can be fairly conversational because any first impressions, feedback, ideas that you have would be much appreciated. And Joanne was mentioning roughly between 12:45 and 1 if people are able to stick around. And if we have time for extra questions, that would be great. So I will be really brief, but try to give you a sense of the rationale and the reason why Jenni and I started collaborating on these materials. And it has to do with my work here at Ryerson. So I'm an instructional designer with a team called Digital Education Strategies, and we're part of the School of Continuing Education at Ryerson. And we produce roughly, or we're involved in the production of roughly 50 to 60 online courses per year. And we collaborate with all the various schools around Ryerson, so science, arts, engineering, community services, You name it, we have program areas here at the Chang School, and we collaborate with subject matter experts and instructors from across Ryerson. And I'm part of a team of around, right now we're at about 22 people. So it includes instructional designers, but also web editors, web developers, web accessibility specialists. We have multimedia production editors as well. And ultimately, as my interest and research in the area of open educational resources and open practices evolved, and I realized that in my role as instructional designer and in the work that I do with instructors in developing online courses, it just represented such a great opportunity to speak to instructors and faculty about the opportunities and the affordances of open education and open educational resources. However, I also realized that as part of a larger team, and we're all cogs in a bigger wheel or pieces in a bigger puzzle, for our team and our collaborators to make best use of open educational resources, it made sense to essentially make sure that we were all on the same page, and that we all had a shared vision and similar understanding of the potential for open educational resources. So Jenni and I decided to put together a couple of facilitation packages, including slide decks, handouts, things like that, and essentially pilot them with my team in the form of 2 workshops. And I would say some of our work was definitely inspired by the work of Ishan Aburadina. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I'll put it in the chat in a short while as well, because his work with the Commonwealth of Learning, looking specifically at OER and in online course development, was a great source of information for us, and sort of built on that and ended up developing these 2 workshops. So I'm going to turn over to Jenni now, because I think she's going to walk us through the first package, and I have links actually. The shortened links are there, but once Jenni gets started, I'll put them in the chat area as well, so that you have the option. Jenni's going to share her screen, but then during or after the session for sure, if you want to take a look, feel free. So Jenni.
All right, great. I'm sharing my screen now. I did put the links in there, Maureen. I hope they're the right links. I think they might be. Let me just make sure my screen is gonna, oh, you have to unshare your screen, I think, Maureen. All right, let's give that a try. Great. So desktop is what I want. There we go. Okay, great. Thanks, Maureen. So as Maureen said, we have piloted this workshop with her digital education strategies team at Ryerson, which was I think bearing fruit and has been really successful within that team. And it's an ongoing story, which is great. We have presented this and we'll be presenting it at a couple of conferences. So national, global conferences, which I think is going to be interesting for instructional designers or even individual instructors. And so one of the things that we're keeping in mind as we do this is that the people who come to the table to participate in these workshops are going to have a spectrum of knowledge of OER and capability in finding OER and even what OER are. They may use it in their practice, they may not call it that. So these workshops are intentionally designed to support a spectrum of learners. So I'm going to launch, so in this folder, Workshop 1, I'm going to go to the one that says Integrating OER Course Design. And there is a presentation, there's a facilitation guide. So if this is something that you might want to facilitate with your team or with a group of departmental administrators who are going to be working on an online course, for example, the facilitation guide is hopefully helpful. But it really rests predominantly with the presentation. So it's a Google presentation. All these materials are open educational resources, which means you can download them, adapt them, share them, remix them, reuse them any way you want at your institution or for your own personal learning. You can share them with faculty members or administrators as you see fit and as is useful to you. Come on, internets. And again, even just the title of the presentation, you can adapt it to anything, as I say, that's useful for your team. Still waiting for my internet to be helpful. Thanks, technology. There it goes, great. So the first slide in the workshop is really just title. The next slide is doing introduction. So I'll just use the example of how we did this with digital education strategies. Around the table are a variety of stakeholders, people who work in instructional design, media developers, web designers, copyright specialists, and leaders on the team were all kind of attending this workshop. And the first, what we want to do is gauge prior knowledge about OER, right? Or the use of open educational resources. So we asked, what's your name? What's your role? What's your interest in open educational resources as part of your practice? And again, there's multiple practices at the table. In activity part 1, we asked them to actually, without giving them any new information, define open educational resources. And that activity can take a bunch of different forms. You can use sticky notes and write them on the wall. You can have them partner together and try and define what open educational resources means to them. And you'll find a lot of responses like free resources, or, you know, there's a spectrum of knowledge in the room, right? So there were a lot of different responses for that particular activity. Just gonna see if it will respond. So for each of these slides in our toolkit are some further facilitation instructions and some additional information. So if you download these slides, make sure you take a look at the notes, because there's some great information in there about how to facilitate and some additional resources. So once they had defined what they thought open educational resources were, we shared a handout with them called Open Terms, Definitions of Open Terms, and that's a handout that's in this folder. And that's really just the standard open educational resource definitions that are going around in the global community. And then we followed through with, you know, what exactly do these definitions mean? And we talked about retain, reuse, revise, remix, redistribute. So this is fairly straightforward information for people who are familiar, but for people for whom this is really pretty new, it's kind of a good walkthrough. In slide number 4, we turned the conversation back to the participants to talk about where they thought the use of these resources might fit as part of their course design processes. And again, here, you know, they each have individual roles in the course design process, but it's obviously things are interdependent, and they depend on each other as team members. But this same conversation could happen with a faculty member who was about to create a new course and was considering the use of open educational resources. And then there's some additional questions that you can ask as part of this prior knowledge gathering. And this is also a really fruitful conversation. A lot of this workshop ends up being dialogue with the participants, talking with them about where they think open educational resources might have value in their work. So we talk about stakeholders, not just the people who are at the table learning about this, but what might open educational resources mean for administrators on their campuses with whom they interact? What might it mean for external funders or research that you can think through, what does it mean for? And we put some examples. So what does it mean for learners, educators, instructional designers, and so on? And these were just some of our ideas. And you can customize this conversation to your own institution, right? Whatever you think your stakeholders are. So we also discussed and had activities around where and how to find open educational resources. So we're talking about, at the beginning of this presentation, we may be talking about open resources in an abstract way. How can we talk about them a little more concretely? And how can participants kind of start to play around with some of the common open educational resource repositories? If your conversation is more discipline specific, for example, if you're meeting with the economics team or an economics professor who's about to create a new course, you can customize this where and how to find OER a little bit to their particular discipline. And there's some really great discipline OER repository lists. If you do some Google searching around something like economics OER or chemistry OER, you might find some really good discipline-specific lists. Part of this conversation about where to find and how to find OER surrounds the quality, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and also the spectrum of work involved. So I think this is a really important dialogue to have with stakeholders. Adopting an open educational resource is pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. You're just using it as is. As soon as you start to think, I want to adapt it to my local context, to my students' needs, then there starts to be a little more work involved. And if you want to create a new resource, that's really where the largest amount of work is going to be involved, especially for course design teams, for multimedia developers, and so on. So talking about that spectrum of work we thought was a valuable conversation. From our friend Ishan Abiwardena that Maureen mentioned from Commonwealth of Learning, and he does a ton of work in the Global South among Commonwealth countries, India and a bunch of other places, Indonesia, where he talks OER with pre-K-12 teachers and post-secondary teachers. So he has a lot of experience talking about the process of thinking about OER. And here in this slide, we're just talking about how to search for the resources that you might be looking for, and how to ensure that the resource is suitable. And suitable is a big word. It has to match the needs of the learner. It has to match the intention of the instructor. So there's a lot when we talk about the quality of resources and suitability of resources that comes into the conversation. So we talked in our workshop about determining the quality of resources. And we'd also talked with participants that this process is not significantly different from what they usually do. If I go to find a resource, an article, use a textbook, I'll read it to figure out whether or not it aligns well with my purposes, right? So that's not so different with open educational resources. But there are some good tools out there to develop a sense of how to rate the quality of a resource. The CRAP one, which is a terrible name, I wish it had a better name, is actually really a great checklist. And in our handouts folder, we have the CRAP model with open as an additional criteria for whether or not the resource is suitable for the instructor's needs. So there's a good handout on that, but I really like that checklist. It's really rich. It has 3 or 4 points per, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for. Maureen, can you help me out? The CRAP model.
Okay, currency, relevance, oh gosh.
Authorship, maybe?
Authorship.
Accuracy.
Oh, accuracy. Accuracy is so
Accuracy.
important. Yeah.
It's in the handouts. They're in the folder. Sorry, I have not committed it to memory.
Yeah. And purpose. I think we got them all.
Purpose, yeah.
But those are really great criteria and good criteria for any resource you're considering using in a course, right? So we really I really like that model. I'm particularly wedded to it. The other thing that we talked about with our team, again, was Creative Commons licensing. So when you start talking about open educational resources, the real gold standard right now for how those resources are labeled is Creative Commons licensing. And your participants may have a spectrum of knowledge about that. So we go through each of the icons for Creative Commons, and the handout that's in the folder gives a little bit of information for each one. What does this actually mean in terms of the user's permissions in using the document, or photo, or video, or whatever it is that it happens to be. And of course, these open educational resources are a huge spectrum of types of resources. There's text, there's books, there's textbooks, there's images, there's audio files, there's so many choices. In this section, we did a little practice session with them on what license, if they were creating something new or were gonna share a photograph in a course, which a lot of, especially in continuing education, I remember working with a landscape design professor who had all his own photos. They were gorgeous photos and really useful. But if you want to share them openly, how do you want to license them, and why do you want to license them that way? So this was a kind of a fun activity, and again, can be customized. Attribution is really important for these resources. This is really important to your librarians or copyright specialists who are working with you to develop, particularly an online course. You want to make sure that any image that you use, any text that you use, if you use you know, a large swath of text from Wikipedia, are you attributing it correctly? And this little handout and walkthrough from Creative Commons is really helpful. And what we did was create a Google Sheet with a couple of well-done examples at the top, and then invited participants to go and find some resources, put a link in or put the image in, and then attribute it correctly, just to give them a little practice based on this model of how to attribute these. And this includes all resources, public domain resources as well. So for example, down the road, if a new instructional designer takes a look at the course or a new copyright specialist takes a look at the course, they're going to want to know what the source of that image was, even if it's public domain. So good attribution is a really strong part of the course design process. And then finally, we just wrapped up our conversations. Again, we had a really rich dialogue, which was really useful and helpful. Lots of questions, lots of ideas for the team, particularly in how their course design process works. And then activities for a next meeting. And we also went through the process of giving them time in between. I think they maybe had 2 or 3 weeks in between the workshops to reflect and think through. And we shared a Google form with them to get their feedback on what they would like to learn in the next workshop. And that was also really valuable. They had some ideas that we hadn't considered, and we were able to kind of adjust our second workshop based on their particular needs. So that's really a walkthrough of what's in this folder and the type of facilitation that we were working on as with this Maureen's team. And I think it has been really successful, and Maureen can speak to that a little bit more to see what kind of follow-up is happening with them. And if you have any questions, absolutely ask away now, or type them into the chat window. And we're going quickly, I think, but what we think the value of what we're trying to do actually lives in these 2 folders, because there's lots of things that an individual practitioner can learn for themselves and then share with their teams by using the tools.
Okay, so should we switch over to workshop 2, Jenny?
Yeah, I just noticed there was a question from Sarah in the chat.
Okay, yeah.
About sharing of the resources. Can we share these resources on I guess, Cambrian's website?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. As long as you attribute them to digital education strategies in the way that the license looks on the front slide or on any of the handouts. And you can adapt them in any way you want. They're a CC BY, which means go nuts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So as a bridge between workshop 1 and workshop 2, we actually sent out a survey to my team just to basically get them thinking about their particular roles in course development and how they envisioned potentially supporting the integration of OER, and just some preliminary questions and brainstorming about what they think might help support them in doing that. That was really just laying some groundwork for the conversations in workshop number 2. And I am going to try sharing my screen again, and I'll do a quick walkthrough, just checking the time. Yeah, less than 5 minutes. I think I can walk through workshop 2, and I'll also try to share a little bit of sort of lessons learned and where we stand right now. Because one of the lessons for sure is that in a group of 22 people, you know, it's, well, we're human beings, right? Learning isn't ever, you know, it's a process that's ongoing. So let me get to the workshop 2 materials, and I'll explain sort of where things stand. So workshop 2, hopefully this is correct. Yes, okay. So we brought my team back together, and I should also say Joanne had asked what the kind of run time for the first workshop was. Joanne, I answered 90 minutes, but I have to correct myself. It was 2 hours. And just a note that even logistically, I know with a team like mine, it's not that easy to get people gathered in the same place at the same time. So what we actually did was we proposed taking 2 successive standing meetings, because we do have team meetings twice a month, and setting OER and these workshops as the core agenda item for those 2 meetings. So both of the meetings were 2 hours long, and we had a reasonable amount of success. I'm hoping Jenni would agree, in covering what we had hoped to in each of the sessions, and then I'll explain the type of follow-up we've had since. So for workshop number 2, What we wanted to do was build on the general awareness that we had hopefully established in workshop 1 and have some more in-depth conversations about making the integration of OER more of a reality in our online course development and in the work and support that we provide to the subject matter experts and instructors with whom we collaborate. So we basically started off just reviewing how people had responded to the initial workshop and sharing just some preliminary thoughts from the survey that we had distributed about where we might move in terms of integrating OER in a meaningful way into our course development process. From there, we kind of wanted to get a little bit more hands-on and say, if we were getting into the guts of some of the tasks around integrating OER, what might it look like? And so we started off with actually a scavenger hunt. And we chose a theme that we thought would be kind of fun and not particular to sort of any one role. So we chose astronomy and we had a list of items, OER, sort of typical types and formats of OER for people to hunt down. And we basically had everyone share their findings in Google spreadsheet that we had set up. So we were compiling the results as we went. And that was kind of fun because we'd already started some conversations about different formats. And as Jenni said, adapting versus adopting, for example, can be a very different undertaking depending on the format of the OER and the file formats that have been made available for that resource. So this, again, was just to sort of get some ideas going and give people a little bit of hands-on practice. From there, what we did was we actually shifted to more of a realistic situation where we took a course that most of the team had worked on in the past. We looked at the course outline for the course and we looked at one learning module for the course, and we said, if we were set to the task of transitioning this course to being more OER based, where would we look for resources and how might we integrate them? And so it was a similar exercise to the scavenger hunt, but with a focus on more familiar territory in a way, because it was a course that we had all worked on at one time or another. So from those two exercises, we debriefed a bit in terms of challenges that people found around discoverability and looking for certain types of resources versus others. And also we kind of tried to tease out, well, if you're a production editor versus an instructional designer versus a multimedia production editor, what would you need to set yourself up for success? And, or, in turn, what would you need to help ensure that we're setting our instructors up for success? So we talked about some of the tools that we already had on hand, and we started some preliminary conversations around other tools, platforms, processes that we might need to start considering if we really wanted to integrate OER in a meaningful way into our course development process. So this is where we pulled in an important piece, and Jenni had selected some really helpful resources in this area to look at starting to frame some ideas around, how do we shape our implementation of and use of OER as a team in course development? What are other institutions doing? How do they clarify their picture of using OER? So we took a look at a few different models out of the States and BC, and just some approaches to sort of choosing a few big chunks to kind of attack to help shape our work in OER. And I would say that that's really, my team is still, we've begun to actively integrate OER in our course developments, but we're also sort of midway through the process of saying, well, what does it mean for digital education strategies to implement the use of OER in our courses? And ultimately, we realized, number one, we had to clarify our vision as a group, and number two, we had to actually articulate a policy around that, because 22 people in a range of different roles, again, everyone prioritizes their work differently, the decisions around what they're doing differently, all for good reasons. And so things like a stated policy help to shape people's understandings around expectations. And so that's where some of the resources in this deck came into play. And I will say one of the challenges that we've had, of course, as a team, I mentioned we're part of continuing ed at Ryerson, but we're embedded within Ryerson, and Ryerson itself as a university is still in early days, and certainly doesn't have an articulated or explicit OER policy. So I would say that in terms of our planning and I guess our clarification of a go forward strategy, yeah, we certainly have reached the point where we have the will among the team members to make use of OER as much as possible, but we are still evolving that kind of policy piece to make sure that we choose something that works for us, but that also going forward could easily integrate into a larger vision for Ryerson. So ultimately, in terms of keeping the momentum going and next steps following the workshops from my team, there were a few things. We actually decided just as a team to have an OER committee for our team. And the conversations that we've been having are around that vision and policy for the team, but also around the practicalities of how we would track use of OER in our courses. And also, I mean, if we're tracking them, you know, making sure that we're measuring the right things and understanding why we're measuring, because our team plays so many different roles that while some of us have a vision and might think that measuring things like savings on textbooks is an important thing, there are other realities that make sense to measure as well. Like, are we actually finding efficiencies in turnaround time in developing a course, having decided to integrate OER versus other types of materials? So I would say that's definitely ongoing with our committee as well. And any documentation or learning that comes out of that, I will happily share, but I'm going to be very honest about the fact that we're still kind of mid-process with that. So Jenny, did you have other things you wanted to add around workshop 2?
No, I think you covered it off really well. And I think both workshop 1 and workshop 2, I think part of the value is the consistency of the terms, the consistency of the concepts for team members, so that everyone has a similar understanding. Because sometimes a faculty member who's working on an online course will go to one person on the team and hear something slightly different, which can be confusing for them. So I think when we're talking about a paradigm as new for everyone as open educational resources, that there's real value in the full team having a similar understanding or an exact understanding kind of in the way. And I think that's, we'll see much more on how Maureen's particular team is doing this, and we'll try our best to gather information from other teams who are doing this to see how it's going for them.
Okay, so I'm just looking, sorry, I just stopped my screen share so I could see the chat. So Sarah, we definitely do have some, a few handouts related to what I was mentioning in terms of organizational goals, and those are filed in the folder that the links that Jenny shared earlier in the chat. But I'd certainly be happy to follow up with you offline as well, just in terms of, you know, in recent weeks and months, the things that my team has been going through, and any other, I can double check whether there are any other resources that we've pulled that I could add to the folder or share with you directly, whatever works for you.
I see Nydia asking who participated in workshop 2. No, it was actually the same team. So the first team was Maureen's full instructional design team at the Cheng School, and it was the same group of participants in the second workshop. And it was pretty, the second workshop, you can often have attrition, but it was still pretty full. So it was good to have the same group come back.
Yeah, and I would actually say those 2 workshops for me were some of the most positive experiences I've had with my team in terms of absolute, you know, I would say that the team was very involved. I think, you know, everyone in their day-to-day work life, you know, sometimes you can feel like there are a few too many meetings, and but there was no meeting fatigue in terms of these workshops. People were very engaged. And Nydia, in terms of the audience, I kind of see actually what you mean about the second one being more directed toward leadership, because there were a lot of points there for consideration that are key for leadership. And the approach that Jenni and I decided to take was to introduce the idea of, you know, the fact that kind of framework was needed. And what we tried to do is essentially have that spur on questions from the group in terms of, you know, what questions need to be answered, and that those questions and answers would help ideally help shape our policy, and it has done so more or less. But that is partly why there definitely are a few things in there that probably would appear to be more geared towards decision makers.
Right, and also just want to add that on a high functioning team, and I feel like DES team is really high functioning, there's a strong degree of autonomy in people's roles in terms of how they conduct them and how they think about personal policy, I guess. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they have an area of expertise, and I think it's good for them to think and reflect and be able to bring to a collaborative team effort around what type of policy we want to form. Some great information. They're also highly collaborative in terms of the course design process itself, which I also really admire on that team.
Great. Well, I'm just going to ask everyone, thank you so much, both of you, first of all. Anyone have any questions? You can feel free to use your microphone if you want in our last waning minutes. But I was just curious do you know if anyone has used your materials at other institutions, or, you know, you've presented it before?
Yeah, I'm not aware that anybody has. Yeah. We'll have to try and find a way to capture that. It's tricky to capture, but, you know,
yeah,
if
for sure.
At this IDIG meeting wants to use it and try it, we'd love the feedback on it. You know, we need a mechanism for that too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
Well, it's wonderful. Lots of great.
I see a question from Sarah. Joanne, I just want to make sure. Oh, yeah. She's asking, you know, workings with college and unis, what is the overall feeling among administrators? It's a really mixed response, Sarah. So I can say, because I see kind of the Ontario bigger picture trying to build open educational resource community in Ontario, I see a lot of different responses. And kind of the continuing response to that is that use of OER is an invitation. It's a personal invitation for instructors, for administrators, for organizations. And whether you choose to use it, whether you think it might have value for you, depends, and it varies. And sure, we see a lot of resistance. We see, yes, it's a fad. We see all kinds of different things. So yeah, bookstore revenue is one of those things we see. So it's still emerging and evolving. We see a lot of different types of conversations, but those conversations even happen at this team level. At DES, you hear some of the same concerns about quality and those kinds of things. So all you can do is kind of continue to create opportunities for people to engage in dialogue, to learn just a little bit more. You can't overwhelm people with too much information, and to share what they're already doing or what they already know. Again, there's a lot of open practice in higher education that is not necessarily formally called OER, but it still is open practice.
Thanks, Jenni, for that. Yeah, I was just curious as to what What was the OER awareness levels for the group that, prior to workshop one? Was it like, were you kind of preaching to the choir, or were there people kind of just really had no or zero? Is there any way that you kind of gauged that beforehand, or how did that work?
Maureen, you would know that better than me.
Yeah. So it was quite varied to be, which I had to sort of check my own assumptions, because I'm so sort of all in and embracing the idea of open and all of its benefits. I had to take a pause for a moment and realize that in the wide diversity of my team, that might not, and it wasn't necessarily the case. And so, in fact, the overwhelming feedback, people had sort of, I would say the actual state going in was that it was a term that was familiar to everyone on the team, but understanding the realities, even of things like CC licensing, things like that, was probably, people were just at very beginning stages or really no awareness at all. And that was the strongest feedback from the first time around, was that people were very appreciative. They said it just helped sort things out for them in their mind. And I think, so overall, I would say we have 4 instructional designers, and I would say, to be fair, probably the most familiar group would be the instructional designers, and we have production editors who are always dealing with permissions and copyright, and so they had some awareness as well, but it was, I would say there was probably more of a learning curve with some of our other team members, even for example with our multimedia production editors. We're really fortunate. The video materials that come out of our team have very high production values. They're beautifully done, and they add a lot to our courses. But they also still, up until this workshop, it would not be unusual for them to use, a lot of stock images and purchased graphics and images and things like that. So just even introducing people to a wider world in terms of the free resources that are out there that could be integrated into things like our videos and our audio visual materials, soundtracks, things like that. That there was a marked sort of difference between going into the workshop and coming out.
Great, thanks. I noticed Ian had a comment and a question, I think, because it is a very realistic perspective that it is the convenience factor that sometimes can be a barrier for using and adapting OER in courses. Yeah. I know that, as instructional designers, we have a lot of publishers knocking on our doors, showing us these fabulous things, but
yeah, it is a really valid concern, Ian, and we're doing our best when we're creating resources, when we're funding projects at eCampusOntario, to think through the necessity of supplemental resources and how useful they are. Things like question banks and PowerPoint slides, and those things that make a textbook easier to use and easier to implement for instructors. So we're keeping an eye on it, and hopefully those things are getting better and better over time.
Yeah, and I would say that's actually partly what motivated me to try working through this with my team, because we have this this sort of limited opportunity, and I felt we should just make the most of it, where we are providing some amount of technical support and in some cases support that they might not otherwise have available to them in the wider scope of their teaching. That whole convenience factor was something that made me pause and think, okay, if this team of resources is being brought together for the sole purpose of supporting course design and development for a given course, how can we make sure that we're as smart as we can be in supporting an instructor who might have any level of interest in adopting OER as part of the course? What are the tools, strategies, and ways of thinking that our team could or should adopt to make sure that we're providing the best support we can. Precisely because, yeah, realistically, there is that challenge, I think, where people do find that with limited time available, if the things that are provided by publishers aren't otherwise accessible, then they may return to the publishers again because they're doing what they can with the time they have.
All right, that's probably a good place to leave off.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you in particular, Maureen and Jenni, for sharing these wonderful resources with us. And again, just to reiterate what Jenni said, if you use them, please let us know. And I'll post that folder links to the IDIG website, as well as follow up with an email with Maureen and Jenni's contact info if needed.
All right, great. Thank you,
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate your interest.
Thank you.